Almost 6 years to the day after it began, the bloodiest war in history drew to a close. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're looking at the final days of World War II and how it finally came to an end. World War II officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, but the events that led to the Allied victory were put into motion earlier in the war. A number of important events took place in April and May of 1945 that helped lead to the war's end. In the early years of the war, the Axis successfully advanced throughout Europe, with invasions of countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. However, 1940's Battle of Britain turned the tide and halted German advances through Western Europe. More failed Axis invasions followed, but 1941's attack on Pearl Harbor finally brought the United States into the fight. By 1942, fighting two fronts proved too challenging for the Nazis, and the Axis lost momentum. The Battle of Stalingrad, in particular, proved to be a turning point, where the Allies took full advantage. 1944 saw more Allied victories, such as the June 6th attack of German forces at Normandy, France, that is now called D-Day. By the end of that year, the Axis downfall was imminent. Amid more Allied pushes through Europe, on April 27, 1945, Benito Mussolini was captured while he tried to escape Italy for Switzerland. He was killed the next day, and this directly led to the surrender of the Italian fascist forces. Just a few days later, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide while hiding from the bloody Battle of Berlin in a bunker. He did so to avoid being caught and killed like Mussolini. May 1st saw Nazi forces in Italy surrender to the Allies. German forces throughout Europe continued to surrender in the days that followed. And finally, unconditional German surrender was announced on May 8th and 9th, and this was followed by a German ceasefire shortly thereafter. The last holdout of the Axis powers was Japan. Though that country had started out winning most battles, the Allies and the Americans began to triumph more and more. The culmination of the nuclear arms race came in early August 1945, when the Allies, led by the United States, dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in an effort to quickly end the war. The day the second bomb was dropped, the Soviets joined the Pacific fight by invading part of Northeast Asia. These shocking events helped finally put an end to the battle. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered after experiencing tremendous casualties. Finally, the surrender documents were signed September 2, 1945. The war was over, and the Allies had claimed victory. Officially, it took until December 13, 1946, for the hostilities to end between the United States and Germany.
So we have been talking about the Holocaust for the last few days. And today we're going to talk about how it all ended. How did the end of World War II and the end of the Holocaust, how did that happen? And what happened because of it? So the first thing we need to clarify is, what is a war crime? Because although you may think that everything is fair in a war, like all goes in a war, that is actually not true. There are certain internationally agreed upon laws and rules as to what is okay during a war, what are you allowed to do, and when have you gone too far. There is such a thing as too far, even in war. So the first thing that defines a war crime, there are 3 categories of a war crime. The first thing is any crime against peace. This involves the preparation and initiation of a war of aggression. So in this case, we're talking about disturbing the peace. Number 2 is conventional war crimes. They're known as conventional war crimes. These are things that include murder, not battle murder, but actual murder, ill treatment, specifically of prisoners of war, and any sort of deportation. And then number 3, crimes against humanity, which include political, racial, and religious persecution of civilians, including genocide. So we're going to be addressing all 3 of these today with the end of the war. So once the Allies won and the Axis powers lost, there were a series of trials to determine who should be blamed for what, who individually needs to be held responsible, And the first of these trials were known as the Nuremberg trials. These were trials set in Germany, and these were for the Nazi officials who participated in World War II. These were held for the purpose of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg trials were a series of 13 trials carried out in Nuremberg, Germany, between 1945 and 1949. So this did take a while. The defendants, who included Nazi Party officials and high-ranking military officers, along with German industrialists, these are people who run factories, lawyers, and doctors, were indicted on such charges as crimes against peace, in other words, starting the war, that invasion of Poland, and crimes against humanity. And this is where we get the Holocaust. Remember, the Holocaust specifically was not part of World War II. It happened to coincide. So once people found out what the Germans had done, now suddenly we're thinking, oh, well, if they used any of this for their war effort, which they did, then we can consider this a war crime. Notably, the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, who was born in 1889, died in 1945, died by suicide and was never actually brought to trial. So he never got to get put on trial and have to face what he did. So here's a quick video about the Nuremberg trials.
It's 1945 and World War II is over. Adolf Hitler is dead. So are his top lieutenants, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels. But dozens of high-level Nazis are still alive and in prison. What do the Allied powers do with them? They take them to court in their own backyard. The Nuremberg trials were a series of international prosecutions that decided the fates of Nazi war criminals. Why hold these trials in the German city of Nuremberg? Well, for one, unlike a lot of German towns, Nuremberg was relatively undamaged by the war, and, just as importantly, the city had been the site of several infamous Nazi rallies. Prosecuting Nazi leaders there brought a symbolic closure to the Third Reich. The trials were administered by the four principal nations of the Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. However, each of these countries had their own laws and legal system, and had to settle on a common framework of justice. They couldn't try each defendant 4 different ways. So in August of 1945, they all sat down and hammered out the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal. With the London Charter, the Allies agreed that the defendants would stand trial and be allowed to have their own defense attorneys. Instead of a single judge, there would be a tribunal, 4 judges, 1 from each Allied country. The London Charter also defined the 3 major charges each criminal would face: crimes against peace, like planning and starting a war crimes, such as killing POWs, and crimes against humanity, in other words, killing civilians, as the Nazis did during the Holocaust. The trials lasted at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1949, but the highest profile cases were brought to court between 1945 and 1946. This period was known as the trial of the major war criminals. Among the 22 Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg were Gestapo founder Hermann Göring, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the German architect Albert Speer. 2 additional Nazis had been indicted, but one, Labor Chief Robert Ley, killed himself before the trials. The other, weapons manufacturer Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, was declared mentally unfit. He was senile. Starting in November of 1945, the tribunal heard testimony and reviewed evidence for 216 court sessions. The horrors and crimes of the Nazis were put on display for all the world to see. In October of 1946, the court handed down its verdicts: 12 death sentences, including those for Göring and Ribbentrop. 3 got life in prison. 4 got lengthy jail terms, and 3 were acquitted. Nothing could undo the devastation of the war. Nothing could bring back the millions of lives lost in the Holocaust, and the millions more lost in battle. But the Nuremberg trials were an important step towards rebuilding an international system of justice. They established important legal precedents for future international trials, including those for Japanese war criminals, and for trials decades later in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The Nuremberg trials officially entered the crimes of the Third Reich into the historical record, so that there would be no doubt about what the regime had done.
All right.
Young people in large...
So continuing on, The Axis powers were also including the Japanese, so we also had what were known as the Tokyo trials. And this is where the Japanese officials, like military leaders, were put on trial, similar to what had happened with the Nazis. And you can actually see in the very center, there's a man wearing glasses there. That is the Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo. And he was considered the most high-profile person put on trial in Japan. So on November 4th, 1948, the trial ended with 25 of 28 Japanese defendants being found guilty. It actually turns out that 2 of the Japanese defendants that were not found guilty had, again, killed themselves, and 1 was considered mentally unstable and unable to be put on trial. On November 12th, the War Crimes Tribunal passed death sentences on 7 of the men, including General Hideki Tojo, who served as Japanese premier during the war. That's the man in glasses. Some thought that Emperor Hirohito should have been put on trial too, but he was protected by U.S. authorities who saw him as a symbol of Japanese unity. The Americans didn't want to further insult the fiercely loyal Japanese people and felt his presence was vital to post-war economic recovery. If we remember at the end of the documentary last week, we talked about how the Japanese were so incredibly loyal to their country and their emperor that they were willing to fling themselves over cliffs. This was something that the Americans did not want to provoke. They did not want to insult the Japanese people any further than the loss already felt. So it was up to the high-ranking U.S. military officials who believed that, not military officials, political officials, who believed that by keeping Emperor Hirohito, who had mainly had a very symbolic and quiet role in the war, but by allowing him to stay emperor, that it would show a level of respect to the Japanese people. It actually turned out very well for the United States, and to this day, Emperor Hirohito's son is the current emperor of Japan. So this legacy is still happening. World War II treaties. So once the trials were over for convicted war crimes, this is where we got the treaties to actually deal with things like reparations and how to move forward. So here we have a photograph of the big three, as they were known. On the far left, we have Winston Churchill, who made it until about the last month of the treaties before he actually passed away and was replaced. In the center there, we have Harry Truman, who was President of the United States. And on the far right, of course, we have Joseph Stalin there, who was the president or premier, I forgot his exact title, of the Soviet Union. Those were the big three who got to decide the fate of the other countries, the Axis powers. So in the picture that we saw there, that was the meeting at the Potsdam Agreement. So the Potsdam Agreement was held near Berlin, Germany, July 17th through August 2nd, 1945. It was attended by the Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain. The leaders issued a declaration demanding unconditional surrender from Japan, although they had previously privately agreed to let Japan keep its emperor, as we discussed in the last slide. Otherwise, the conference focused on the European theater. Mainly, Germany was to be held accountable, but nowhere near the level set by the Versailles Treaty after World War I. We did not want to have another rise of Hitler and another disaster. Thank goodness we learned from our mistakes to any degree. The Paris Peace Accords also happened, and these were signed February 10th, 1947, 2 years later, when the victorious wartime Allied powers, USA, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and then we're also going to add France there. Even though France was a Nazi-controlled country, there was the Free France that was running out of Great Britain, still maintaining a Free France. So they got some say in this second treaty talk. They negotiated the details of treaties of peace for the lesser World War II enemies. In other words, not Germany and Japan, but the lesser enemies, Italy, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Finland. So those countries also had to be dealt with as well. So through those treaties, we have to talk about what happens next. So we did not get another major world war right after this. This was not a World War I leading directly to World War II. We did have complications, but the complications looked different this time. The first thing that we had to consider was what happened in Europe. So Germany, which had occupied much of Europe during World War II, remember Hitler had expanded his empire. Many of the countries in the West returned to the same governments and borders as they had prior to the war. So countries like Poland that were initially invaded regained their independence. So Poland became a free country again. France became free again. Belgium became free again. And we did get many independent countries back. However, Germany was not left alone. Germany was divided up into Eastern and Western Germany. So we kind of split it right down the middle. The eastern part was controlled by the USSR, which was Russia, and the western part was by the remaining allies. So that would be Great Britain, France, and the United States. You can see here what that ended up looking like. So that red section was called the Soviet sector. It was also home to Berlin. The green was the British sector, and you can see a little bit of yellow in there. Well, that's part of the American claim. The blue is the French sector, and the light blue that you see there, that's the region of Alsace and Lorraine that was not 100%, no one was 100% sure whether that was German or French at the time. So there was a little, it had French control, but there was still some conflict over whether or not that was France or Germany. The thing you may notice about Berlin is if you look very closely, Berlin is the capital of Germany, and Berlin, although it was entirely in the Soviet sector, was split up between the four powers as well. Since it was the capital city, all of the four allies wanted to have partial control. So once again, you see the blue section there is actually the part that was controlled by France on the west side. British was the green section on the west side, and the yellow is the US section on the west side. And then the east portion of Berlin was Soviet controlled. So we're going to start to notice a trend of east versus west, Soviet versus the rest of them. And that's where we're going to be headed next. Don't you worry. So what's next for Europe in terms of the actual country itself? Not just the political borders, but as you can see in the picture here, the country had been ravaged by war. The entire countryside of Europe had just been destroyed by blitzkrieg bombing and every possible warfare you can imagine from World War II. So there were different approaches as to how we were going to fix Europe. So the USSR, in all of the area that they controlled, so they took control of a few countries in Eastern Europe, the ones that were next door to them, where they had fought the Germans. So including Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. So those countries kind of went under the Soviet wing. The Soviets were going to help them regain their footing, rebuild their economy, rebuild the buildings. So the USSR kind of took those countries as their little project to rebuild. Many other countries in Europe were in much need of financial aid due to the roads, bridges, buildings, and more that had been destroyed in the fighting. And the United States offered aid in the form of the Marshall Plan to help Europe, specifically Germany, recover. So the United States had learned from the Versailles Treaty, and they did know that a weak Germany would potentially again turn into a dangerous Germany. So the United States figured out this Marshall Plan to help rebuild the economy of Germany and help make them a stronger force in Europe. So there was not that stress and depression and hopelessness from before. So we're going to watch a quick video about the Marshall Plan and see what that entailed and how that worked. Nope. Let's try that again.
Hooray! World War II is over! But Europe is in ruins. What can a country like the United States do to help? How about setting aside over $13 billion to help rebuild the smoldering continent? That's what the European Recovery Plan, aka the Marshall Plan, sought to do. Restore the European economy by giving foreign aid to countries that needed it. It was a brilliant move to win the peace by George C. Marshall, the plan's creator. Marshall had been a career military man, and during the war had served as the Army's chief of staff. He oversaw the U.S. military strategy and was one of the key figures behind the Allied victory. Marshall retired from the Army at the end of the war, but President Truman valued his brains too much. After serving as ambassador to China, Marshall was appointed Secretary of State in early 1947. Soon after, he developed his European Recovery Plan and announced it in June of that year. From April 1948 to December 1951, the United States shipped food, fuel, machinery, and money to European countries. The goal was to help them get back on their feet after the devastation of the war. In one sense, this was good deed foreign policy. The United States was being a friend, using its considerable resources to help war-torn Europe. Plus, the last time the world left a conquered nation in ruins, Nazi Germany rose to power. But there were other reasons to implement the Marshall Plan as well. By investing in the economies of European countries, the U.S. helped create new markets for its exports. Perhaps we could interest you in a Buick. There was a strategic objective too. The U.S. wanted to isolate the Soviet Union, to keep it from expanding its sphere of influence beyond Eastern Europe. How better to make capitalism appealing than to spread around money in a war-torn country? By the way, here are all the countries that received Marshall Plan aid in alphabetical order. Ready? Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and West Germany. Now, if you listen closely, you might have noticed a couple of major European countries that weren't on that list. The USSR didn't trust the U.S. intentions with the Marshall Plan and forbade Poland and Czechoslovakia from receiving American aid. Too bad for them, because the plan worked. The gross national product of Marshall Plan countries grew as much as 25%. It put Western European industry back on its feet. The American export economy boomed, and Soviet-influenced communism was contained to Eastern Europe. Nice work, George Marshall. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The greater honor for Marshall, though, may have been seeing Europe rise from the ashes, thanks in part to the plan that bears his name.
You may start to be noticing a little bit of a trend of the Allied forces, with the exception of Soviet Union. You're not wrong if you're feeling that. So if you're thinking this might potentially lead to further conflict between the Soviet Union, who was never truly friends with the British, French, and Americans, but was simply a political ally, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, we are going to start to see a separation of those powers. So what is next for Asia? Because again, the United States and the Soviet Union and China were fighting in Asia as well. And so that again did have to be fixed and helped. So the US and the Allies occupied Japan, much like they occupied Germany. They maintained control as Japan recovered from the war. Japan would become an independent nation again in 1952. The Allies would all leave and give them full and complete autonomous control. As of today, Japan has one of the strongest economies in the world and remains very close allies, both politically and economically, with the United States. Korea also had much of the battlefields here, since that was the connection between China, Japan, Soviet Union. So the Korean Peninsula also needed to have some recovery efforts. So in Korea, the Allies and the USSR, again, the Allies meaning the United States, Great Britain, and France, once again, versus the USSR, that one allied force that nobody seemed to get along with. In Korea, the Allies and the USSR, Russia, divided up the country into North and South Korea. The North being controlled by Russia and the Soviet Union, and the South being controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France, with main control being with the United States since they had fought most of the time in the Pacific arena. The plan was for Russia to control the North and the Allies to control the South until a free election could be held for the entire country. This never happened, as Russia later refused, and the country is still split to this day. So before World War II, there was only one Korea. It was called Korea. After World War II is when we got the North Korea versus South Korea. So many of the issues that we're having in the Koreas today started right around this time period. And again, we're going to deal with some of this in the coming weeks. In China, a civil war continued that had started prior to World War II. It was between the communists and the nationalists. The communists were influenced by Karl Marx and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been a very good friend to China throughout this war, China being the barrier between the Soviet Union and Japan. So the Soviet Union did provide quite a bit of aid to the Chinese, and the Chinese in return did fight on the behalf of the Allies, specifically on the Soviet Allied side. And then we also had the nationalists, the ones who had been in control before the communist uprising began. The communists won their Chinese Civil War, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, which is why today China is known as the Republic of China and is still a communist nation, and Taiwan is known as the Democratic Republic of China, and still claim to be the correct or official China. So there is still tension to this day between the Chinese Civil War and the role that communism played. All right, it is time to submit your notes. So make sure you click the blue button that says Submit Assignment in the top right. Click on the Google Drive tab, upload your notes from today, and click Submit Assignment and confirm and confirm and confirm again until you see Submitted in the top right corner. Tomorrow will be a quiz. Make sure if you are unsure of some of the information, go back, look through your notes. You are welcome to use your notes on your quiz, and remember, you only get 3 tries. So take your time, read through the instructions, and when it comes time to that essay question, make sure you're writing in full sentences. That's the key for the week, are full sentences. So have a great day, and we'll see you later.